Hello, everybody. My name is Lamis Jamil, and I'm going to present Permaculture's contribution to Himalayan resilience, which is part of my master's dissertation on reincarnating Himalayan resilience for the Center of Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes. I would like to extend my thanks to Paolo for facilitating the session, and for the Permaculture International Research Network, and for the participants who are here today. And I would like to say hello to Jeremy, because we also had a brief discussion before on this topic. Next slide, please. Okay, the presentation, the aim of the presentation is to talk about the aspects of permaculture that impact the way resilience is understood in the Himalayas, and thereby establishing why it is important to integrate permaculture into academia from a student perspective. Your participation is welcome at any time. We will try to come up with a mind map about the topic, and so please do come forward and introduce yourselves and share your thoughts on the YouTube comments or in Google Hangouts. Next one, please. Okay, the structure is, first we're going to talk about resilience and international development and how that is understood. Then we're going to talk about resilience and permaculture in the Himalayan region, which is my research topic. And thirdly, we're going to talk about the contribution of permaculture to academia. And then we're going to have a few discussion questions. Next one, please. Next one. Okay, so recently, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was commenting on his vision for the 2019 Climate Change Summit, where he mentioned climate change as a defining issue of our time. And that is, we are facing a direct existential threat, and that we are lacking, despite the Paris Agreement, we're still lacking in leadership, a sense of urgency, and a commitment to multilateral response. Now, among these words, climate change, disasters, vulnerability, conflict, the word resilience springs up. And currently, it is sort of like a buzzword, and buzzwords do change. But there's some literature on what resilience is, and it's defined in many ways. Next slide, please. So resilience can be defined as the ability to bounce back, to transform, to adapt. There's different ways that it's understood, and there's different ways that it's visualized. So one example from Brian and O'Keefe is, for example, the top-down enabling versus the bottom-up participatory, and how many percentages of that. Next one, please. Next one, please. Okay, and then there's this one on by Holling, and it's about the connectedness and resilience and potentials, potential to bounce back, potential to transform. And next one. Then this one is about the relationship between vulnerability, resilience, and adaptive capacity. And next one, please. And from here, a lot of the latest research on disasters in the UK talks about resilience as a cross-sectoral, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary word. And so we're seeing a shift from sectoralism to holism. However, this constitutes a problem because how do we define resilience and how do we measure it? If it's a holistic thing, should we have to separate it? We need the reductionist approach. Should we take it as it is? So there are some things here. However, it's interesting that there's this shift going on to holism. Next one. And for example, if you look at the metaphor, if we think of resilience building as kind of like immunity building. So if resilience is to society, what immunity is to the human body. And so this is an interesting way here. For example, there's an Aboriginal medicine wheel, and it talks a lot about the relationships, growth with new meaning, changing one's views, adversity, how to look at things, and how to work from the inner to the outer. which is very interesting. Okay, next one. Okay, so the thing is, people don't walk around saying, I'm resilient, right? So when we talk about resilience, we have to say we are being resilient. Well, about what? And for whom is this resilience? And how do we measure it? And who is going to measure it? Who decides what the indicators are? Another thing, there's a lack of research on frameworks to integrate indigenous knowledge into modern day challenges. And a lot of recent debates have been talking about paradigm shifts and transforming towards circular economies, sociocracy, and things of the like. And for example, here, the Red Plus saying that there's, in order to achieve the Paris Agreement, we need more nature-based solutions. So this is an overview, a brief overview of what resilience considers in terms of academia. Okay, next one. Okay, now shifting to permaculture. It's quite interesting here because some people consider that it is a framework and some people consider it as no framework. But then it depends on how we define a framework, right? So I think in a way, people who say that there is no framework, they mean that it's not like replicable in the way that maybe mainstream development solutions are. And in a way, they mean that it is very local and very contextual. So whether we would like to say framework or no framework, if we look at the core of it, which is like human rights, fair share, and ecological consciousness about people and Earth, we have strategies and principles that must inform our decisions. But most importantly is the conscious, intentional design. And as one key informant for my research told me, a lot of people practice permaculture without the design. So design is very central. Intentional design is very central. Okay, next one. Okay, next one. Okay, so why the interest in the Himalayan region? So first, there's a small personal motivation here because I have spent time in Nepal prior to this, and the main interest is if we look at the Himalayas as a bioregion. So we're not talking about political boundaries here. We're talking about an actual ecosystem like bioregion. We have Bhutan, and then Bhutan with the highest gross national happiness index in the world. We have, and it's turning organic and biodynamic and even into institutional policy. And we have Tibet, which is the third pole supplier of water to many basins in Asia. We have Nepal, which has trying to turn into organic state. We have Kashmir, and which has Sikkim, Darjeeling, parts of Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan and northern India as well. And even in India, there are many movements, like trying to go the Green Initiative and a lot of seed saving of Danya and around agriculture initiatives. There's many initiatives happening within this region that are trying to restore this habitat. And as one of the key informants pointed out to me when he first thought about the bioregion, he said, look at this strip of green and look at everything else above it and below it. So I wanted to share that with you. And there are many threats to this region, locally and as a whole. So some threats could be from cultural erosion. I mean, it differs from country to country. For example, in Nepal, the biggest export of Nepal is people. So a lot of people are leaving the villages. There's disconnect from nature. People are forgetting their traditional and indigenous ways of living. There's a lot of plastic. In Tibet, the glaciers are melting, monsoon, wrecking many parts of Nepal and India, conflict in Kashmir. So there's a lot of threats. However, the area does show a lot of resilience. There's still a lot of people who are practicing local, indigenous, and traditional practices, and the mental state, the diversity, community spirit, for example, are ways that people that I've interviewed have identified this as being contributing to their resilience. Next one, please. So, because of the scant literature on permaculture and resilience, let alone the Himalayan region, I've had to really formulate a way to make a case for this. So I interviewed some people that have to do, for example, between permaculture and resilience. And then I had other people for resilience and Nepal, whether it was permaculture or not. So I included not only permaculture, I included other things like biodynamics, natural farming, natural building, or any other people like talking about sustainable practices, basically, anything sustainable. And so I talked to different people, initiators of permaculture projects, facilitators of permaculture projects across Nepal, in Himalayas, anywhere outside in Asia and anywhere outside in the world. So of course, the highest concentration is the one around Nepal. So there was selected 3 case studies, each having distinct characters. One is about the Himalayan Permaculture Center in Western Nepal, which is about grassroots rural permaculture that's been there for 20 years. And it survived the Maoist insurgency. It survived. It helped during the earthquake. It was a bit far from the earthquake. And its collaboration with Almost Heaven Farms in eastern Nepal, in Elam, who are working with permaculture for a social cause with Prisoners Assistance Nepal, and how they came together. So the Himalayan Permaculture Center and Almost Heaven Farms came together, and they are working on the Resilience to Recovery project, basically addressing 2 areas in Nepal that have been wiped out by the earthquake and designing them from the beginning using permaculture design, so with resilience in mind for the long term. The other case study is about Piple, which is a very remote region in Dading district, and it started initially as an Earthbag project, so using earthquake resilient building, but then it started to incorporate other elements of permaculture. And then the third case study is permaculture in Kashmir with the Green Permaculture Trust, and that is very interesting in itself as well. And so I conducted interviews with the people that are in the case studies, and I also conducted a lot of interviews that did not have to do with the case studies to try to understand, to have a critical understanding of permaculture. So some people, for example, were doing very sustainable, interesting practices, but not calling them such, which doesn't matter because everyone's ideas were welcome. So in that way, I tried to involve as many people as I could. Okay, next one. Okay, so one of the main things I had asked the interviewees was, is there an existing culture of resilience where you are? And what were some of the threats that are facing your project and how did you overcome them? And then I also asked them about how do they define permaculture, how do they define resilience, and what is their vision? So regarding the first question, existing Himalayan cultures of resilience, there was a very interesting there were very interesting findings coming out of this. For example, this is about Nepal, the geography, the topography, and the influence of remoteness on the ability of people to sustain themselves and to be independent, the history of the country, spirituality and religion and community spirit, subsistence agriculture, the effect of livelihoods and migration, and today's current topic of climate change, disaster and conflict, and many more. So next one. Preliminary findings, because I have not finished my analysis yet. It will be done in a month. So preliminary findings, we're trying to establish in what ways does permaculture design contribute to the resilience framework. people define permaculture and resilience differently, and from the people that I interviewed who had been close or had directly studied under Bill Mollison or the original people who were around the permaculture movement, they had different ideas and thoughts about things than people, for example, from my generation who were like hearing it in the third, fourth time from some other sources. It's very interesting how some things are similar and some things are different. The shifting ethics of foreign aid, a lot of people doing do-it-yourself approaches, and social media being used to report evidence to donors, and donors being able to follow that up using social media. And for example, one of the things that mainstream development sometimes struggles about is the lack of longitudinal research. So also permaculture struggles with evidence, as Thomas was saying, evidence-based. So how can we do that? You know, it's a question. And among the projects, the long-term sustainability was key, and different projects had been trying to integrate permaculture at different levels, at an individual level, organizational level, district, and even governmental level. So, for example, in Kashmir, they try to institutionalize it in the agricultural educational system at university, and the next step is to do it at the governmental level. And the interesting thing that I found was that people who really care about permaculture did not really care about whether people use the term or not. So it's the problem of the label sometimes that was found. So next one, please. So another thing, preliminary finding about permaculture's inbuilt resilience. So if we look at the zoning as one of the design methodologies in the design of permaculture, a lot of people talked about resilience at the zone 0-0. So, you know, when we talk about reflexivity, our inner resilience and our outer resilience, and that is already in permaculture. And a lot of people, for example, like Luby McNamara, are talking about cultural emergence and zone 0-0, so which is actually the inside the people part. Next one. Next one, yeah. And so basically, permaculture, why do we need permaculture for academia? There's a lot of gaps in mainstream academia about international development and resilience. For example, as I mentioned before, the frameworks for integrating indigenous knowledge into modern day lives. A lot of the current disaster research is calling for a more holistic interdisciplinary approach, and they don't know how. A third reason, for example, is the longitudinal research. And permaculture needs to prove that and contribute to that. And the need to formalize permaculture as a valid approach in mainstream development and humanitarian practice at different levels. What I mean by permaculture here, I highlight that it's not just the label permaculture, it's sustainable practices, basically. And awareness about solutions is key. You know, if we're going to think about emergencies and disasters and we're going to panic, you know, we're going to be frozen. But we need to be aware about solutions, for example, that Jeremy proposed, that Thomas proposed. There are some solutions, and some people are trying to make small things with big impact. So whether we choose to do them or not is optional, but we need to be aware of it. And one of my key informants, Rosemary Murrow, said that she went as far as saying ecological literacy should be next to the right to education, you know? So, because in times like ours, we all need to understand, you know, how to, where our place in the world is and how we're part of that. Okay, next one. Okay, so basically the framework of resilience, one of the frameworks, the interconnectedness and the framework or no framework of permaculture. How do we put this together? What comes out of it? How does permaculture contribute to the resilience framework? This is the question. Next one. And I'd like you to read this quote from a book called Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. It says, around the world, in every sphere of life, from psychology to physics, from farming to the family kitchen, there is a growing awareness of the interconnectedness of all life. New movements are springing up, committed to living on a human scale and to more feminine and spiritual values. The numbers are growing and the desire for change is spreading. These trends are often labeled new, but as I hope Ladakh has shown in a very important sense, they are very old. They are in fact a rediscovery of values that have existed for thousands of years, values that recognize our place in the natural order, our indissoluble connection to one another and to the earth. Next one. Yeah, and I would like to open the floor here for some discussion, if we still have time. So what is resilience for you in your field of work? And can you think of any examples where permaculture design was used to overcome long-term or short-term threats? How does permaculture interact with indigenous knowledge? And how do people react to the word permaculture, and what are some of the limitations of it? Is something I'm interested to ask the participants.
Thank you very much, Lamis. So how do we proceed now? Do you want to ask these questions to all the participants who are now present?
Yeah, if anybody would like to contribute, yes. I think I can, we can, how much time do we still have?
Well, we are a bit over time, so now we are 2 minutes
Okay.
over time. So just let's think how to use this efficiently, because of course we need some feedback.
Yes. Okay, so I'll just continue then, just to the last slide. And then if anybody would like to have any comments on these questions, we can go back to them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I will add this later if we end up saying something. And then I would like to tell you about this website. It's a list of academics interested in permaculture. You might like to add yourself to the list or to find someone who has a similar interest to you. And yes, the next one. So yeah, if you have any thoughts or if you'd like to connect for the future, this is my contact. And thank you for your presence. And I'm happy to hear your comments and feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we have some comment or question from Jeremy, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if others have questions, I'm happy to wait, or I can ask a question now.
Yeah, please.
Well, Lamis, thanks for your presentation, and I know you've had a chance to read my article on the relationship between permaculture and what we're calling indigenous bioculture in Peru. And I just want to reiterate that my concern is that permaculture could end up becoming yet another imposition from Europeans and European Americans on the global South. And that's my main concern. I think that permaculture came out of a very specific context in Australia with Mollison and Holmgren. I think it made sense in that context. I think it makes sense in certain other contexts, including where I live in Victoria, BC. I live in a neighborhood that has been profoundly impacted by permaculture. There are many people in my neighborhood who call themselves permaculturalists. We have a public permaculture garden. We have permaculture trainings at the university that I teach at. There are courses on permaculture. It's become hugely influential here in the West, because the West needs permaculture, because we're still laboring under and being affected by things like industrial agriculture. But I'm less convinced of the need, so-called, for permaculture in ancient indigenous non-Western societies. If you look at a place like Peru, there's an ancient indigenous tradition of sustainable agriculture. In South Asia and in the Himalayas, of course, there are ancient traditions there. So my concern is that I don't want permaculture to become yet another imposition, even a benign imposition on the part of the West. And I was influenced, and I'll just finish the question here. I was influenced by my work with Frédéric Apfel-Marglin in Peru, And her point of view is that if permaculturalists are going to come from the north and go to the south and work with people in the south, they really should be invited to do so. And they should be working within a framework that makes sense locally, so that permaculture does not become another form of benign neo-colonialism, even if it has good intentions. What we don't want to do is undermine local traditions. I mean, Himalayans know how to live sustainably. I mean, maybe they've lost touch with that in some ways because of the West, but anyway, I'll leave it there as a comment more than as a question.
Okay, Lamis, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy, for that. Yes, I was the reason that's exactly the reason why I'm questioning permaculture's contribution to Himalayan resilience. I'm not assuming that it needs it. So it was actually one of my questions in the interview guide. Does Nepal need permaculture, and why? So what came out, I mean, this is preliminary findings still, but the kind of threats that they're facing, for example, like you said, the loss of values, the disconnect, the migration, the livelihoods, then permaculture comes in kind of like a repackaged indigenous knowledge. And you're completely right, and I do agree with you that unless it works with the local situated and indigenous knowledge, it can just risk becoming another neoliberal action. So exactly, and that is why I was very careful to try to select case studies that are trying to show some sustainability, in the sense that the exit strategy, you know, they're just. I think when my paper is done, it will be more clear. But I completely agree with you that there's the threat that something with a good intention can have, you know, different consequences. And in what ways does permaculture contribute at all, if anything, to resilience in the Himalayan region is the research. So I think the answer for your question would, or your comments would be more clear after the findings are complete. Thank you, though.
I mean, Pablo, do we have another minute here?
Maybe we time, but I think maybe we can spend some more minutes.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
I think that we need all to mute our microphones. Who does not speak, there is an echo, because if we have a loudspeaker, it comes like an echo. So I think that we can ask like maybe one or two more questions or brief comments, but very brief. So do you want to comment something?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, yes.
Well, I was going to say that a kind of counterpoint is the work that Jeff Lawton is doing in Jordan. And if those of you are not familiar with him, he's a very well-known permaculturalist, and he's been working in Jordan, which has some of the lowest water resources of anywhere in the world. And that has been a collaboration between some of the ministries in the Jordanian government and Jeff Lawton. It has not been a kind of imposition, but at least in my reading, it's been a collaboration that very much works with local systems. So maybe that is a kind of counterpoint. But if I think about Peru, you know, I really think we need to keep in mind the element of spirituality too, religion, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. Permaculture does come out of a kind of Western scientific tradition that, again, might make sense in a place like Victoria, where I live, but just really does not make sense when you're working with Quechua-speaking people in Peru, whose worldview is very much infused with the concept of spirit. So I keep seeing these kinds of bumps, these kind of conflicts that I'm concerned about.
Thank you very much. Any other brief question or comment? Or we just move on? Okay, so thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and I'm happy that we opened this discussion, that it's actually a lot of questions in permaculture, and I can say that in Ukraine it is difficult perceived because it really requires this systemic approach, which is maybe culturally lacking in our society. And also our intention to move permaculture to academic education, some people resist because they think that it became as informal education and should always live as informal. So in general, I think that permaculture should be more flexible in its approaches.